welcome to this, our third week, second, I suppose you'd say, proper module, but definitely week 3, we're looking at the question of what happens if we don't think in human terms. And our primary chapter this week is the chapter from Simon Dalby, who is a geographer, a political geographer, does a lot of work though on international issues, and quite a good scholar. So he has been invited to write the chapter for our reading this week, and he uses the example of human activity and climate change to give some credence to his discussion of our tendency sometimes to not think in human terms. And I just want to ponder that for a second, because we tend to think of what does he mean when he asks this question if we don't think in human terms? I mean, to you and I, that might seem kind of like a no-brainer. We think in human terms all the time. So what's the big deal here? But do we think in human terms? I think sometimes when we engage in political science, as we've talked about in the past, we have a tendency to engage in thinking that, while very well intended, is oriented towards scientific analyses and scientific conclusions. And sometimes it's hard to see the human being in the science, if you know what I mean. We try to, in fairness and in good faith, we try to work in a way that seems impartial. We try to work in a way that doesn't appear biased, and so we're afraid to reveal our emotional selves, if you will, sometimes in our work, out of fear of appearing to be biased. But what I think Simon Dalby's doing here this week is inviting us to think in maybe a non-scientific way, to think in an emotional way, to put human beings back in the picture, to put ourselves back in the picture, and for better or for worse, because that's complex. What does it mean to put human passions and energies back in the mix, so to speak? We like to look at ourselves as somehow separate to nature. But what if we're part of nature? And what if the change that occurs in nature can be traced back to human activity? Similarly, what's wrong with a politics that looks at climate change, for example, as something that is oriented towards saving or rescuing human life on a planet that might be warming? So, sorry, we're going to get a little bit of background noise here just because of the location I'm in right now, but hopefully that background noise won't be too interrupting for you. So I'll continue the lecture if that's okay. So, just broadly speaking, when did human beings first start to think and worry about climate change? Arguably, in the last 20 to 30 years, we've started to see phenomena going on in the world that do leave us with the clear sense that human activity is shaping the world, but also in a way that we just haven't really been able to anticipate or understand before. The extent to which human beings are able to change the climate, for example, only really started to become apparent for us when we started to think about our impact on the environment about 20 to 30 years ago. But I think the risks of human activity on the planet really became very apparent for us once we started to think about the so-called risk society, and that is something that came to us in a bang and a whoosh, so to speak, when we saw in April 26th, 1986, as Simon Dalby discusses, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in Ukraine, which was, for those of you who are alive then, a very memorable event. Certainly was for me, because many people, especially those of us growing up in Europe, as I was at the time, were distinctly worried about the fact that something that was happening so very far away could have impact upon people living quite thousands of miles away. When in human history had the discrete activity of human beings in one part of the world had impact on the activity on human beings in a totally other part of the world, so far down the road? It really was a striking reminder or sign that the stakes of human activity had really changed. And once that had happened, of course, I think you start to see a new cognizance, a new respect for the impact of human life and human activity. So it's just something to think about, that this is a sort of the marker of a new age. Prior to then, spiritually, philosophically, people had always thought about human activity as being something like as getting a free pass, so to speak, because whether you were a Marxist or a Christian, the tendency was to look at the environment as something that was just there. that we could use for the betterment of the human species, the betterment of the human condition. We didn't really think about how human activities would impact our health and our well-being and the well-being of the ecosystem that sustained us. So now that we're seeing these events happen, people are starting to become much more aware and much more cognizant of these dynamics. So let's just put a brief outline in here. We have a little WALL-E down in the bottom right-hand side of the slide here. That's just to remind us about something that we can talk about later on. But of course, the movie WALL-E is very interesting because quite precisely it's a catastrophic movie, even though it's for kids, right? It reveals a certain catastrophe. It bespeaks, sadly, a kind of a human failing that might happen in the future, whereby we fail to realize that our activity makes a difference in the long run. And WALL-E, of course, is a children's movie, but very powerfully reminds us about some of the forces that were driving this potential scenario. Looking backwards, retrospectively, of course, for WALL-E, it's very apparent that by the end of the film that WALL-E has realized that, you know, human beings, while we get a second chance in the film, we're very much at the center of the destruction of the planet. So anyway, let's just look ahead here. We have from the question of the environment to the question of the biosphere, we have a case study, which is climate change, and we're of course basing this on Simon Dalby's chapter. And then we reflect on Simon Dalby's challenge to us, which is that we should think about human beings as being at the center of climate change. And then we think about responses, and I do sort of digress a little bit from Simon Dalby's chapter here somewhat, because I think his key goal might be just to sort of put the evidence down about climate change, but we maybe want to talk a little bit more about the types of diverse responses. And my key goal here is to sort of talk about the fear of science, the emergence of green theory, and a character, philosopher that is very famous these days, Slavoj Žižek. And we have a little video clip to watch from him, and I'll post that separately to this lecture, and you can enjoy that on your own time. That's about a 5 or 10 minute clip, but it's very worth watching, and there'll be a question on that in the exam. So let me just bring up my notes here. So from the environment to the biosphere, we have long thought about the environment as merely something out there, something passive that doesn't really have much of a relevance for us as you know, human beings going about our lives here on planet Earth. And it's clear, though, that as time has passed and globalization has increased the proximity of communication and contact and interaction between the human, decreased the proximity of interaction between human beings on the planet, that we have now today a very complex relationship between growth, which of course is predicated on resource consumption, and globalization. And I appreciate that this is something that a lot of people debate. For example, there's an argument to be made by many people who defend market-based globalization, or you know, financial globalization. The one case to be made in defense of this is that, you know, globalization is a huge boon for efficiency, and where you have efficiency, you generally have less impact on the environment, and that's fair enough. And I do actually share and agree with that proposition. I think that the interdependency that globalization brings about can actually be a positive force for the environment in the long run. But I think also that those who suggest that we have yet to pay the full price for our growth are definitely onto something, because what are they suggesting? They're suggesting, in fact, that the externalities of our transportation systems do make an impact on the environment that is not reflected in the price that we pay for our goods at the cash register. And some people would say in some instances that that price is negligible because it's absorbed, if you want to think about it that way, by the cheaper cost that people are paying at the cash register. That the reality is the resources that would be required to grow everything locally, to sort of lose the economy of scale that that today's interdependency has given us, that today's globalization has given us, would actually sort of bump up the environmental impact, so to speak. But I think the evidence is pretty much in that because we, for example, don't pay the full price of our fuel. There's a classic example of just think about this for a second. If you go to a 7-Eleven in Columbus or in Chillicothe, I don't think there's a 7-Eleven in Chillicothe, but say there was, there's an equivalent store. You go down there, you want to buy a sandwich, and you find that the sandwich was produced in, say, Philadelphia. And that's remarkable that we live in an age where that's possible, but that sandwich was made that morning in Philadelphia in a large centralized processing plant. Which, is how we make the argument that there's an economy of scale there, because if you have a centralized processing plant, that's one less building you have to heat, that's one less electricity bill you have to pay. So the scale, the size of the central processing plant gives us a lot of scale, bang for our buck, so to speak. We don't have to employ as many security guards to protect the places. There's all kinds of ways in which there are savings and efficiencies in centralizing our production. And then, of course, we raise the question of how do the goods and services get from point A to point B? Well, they travel via truck. And the question is, right there and then, do the savings between our environmental consumption through the centralization of our production and the spendings in our energy usage to get the goods and services from the central processing plant to the local point of sale, do they outweigh each other? Or do they balance out? And the argument that the environmentalists are making in globalization is that, in fact, they don't balance out. Why? Because there's no incentive yet to achieve savings on the resource consumption through transportation. We don't actually pay our fair share in the transportation of the goods and services in terms of the price of our gasoline, because the price of the gasoline does not reflect the pollution that is put into the atmosphere and the impact on all our net welfare. That is the net welfare of the entire planet, every person on the planet, in terms of impact vis-a-vis global warming, rising sea levels, and that's a huge problem for us. So if the true price of the impact of the gasoline consumption on our total planetary lives was reflected in the price at the point of sale, then our sandwich would become so much more expensive that we would return to more local methods, and we would effectively, as a net side effect of that, also increase local production. We would have new jobs for local farmers. We would have new sort of sustainability and reduce our impact on the environment. And I don't know the answer to this question. I mean, it's a really fascinating debate, but my sense is that looking at the evidence that's coming in, is that this is one very serious point of weakness in the argument in favor of globalization. So many people would respond then to say that on a case-by-case basis we need to evaluate where globalization can continue and where globalization should be curtailed. When we get a large bang for our buck in terms of the centralization of production, we should continue, and where we don't, we should return to more local methods of production. And that's the nature of the debate. Can we continue as we are? Indeed, it's argued that we can't, because simply put, our current consumption rate is too high and it's not sustainable, and clearly it is putting an impact on the environment. So this idea of a limitation on our growth, a limitation on our ability to grow, was first raised in the 1970s with the 1987 Brundtland report then coming online that first introduced the concept of sustainable development. And so really this is at the center of what I'm talking about in this slide, this concept of sustainable development. To what extent should we continue to globalize, and to what extent should we reverse globalization and go back to local production in order to try to save the biosphere and to shift from an understanding of the environment as something that's merely there for us to use to a more sensitive understanding of nature that's bound up in the concept of the biosphere, where we're kind of all in this together. So if we're thinking about the term biosphere, biosphere is another way of speaking about the environment then, that thinks about our footprint, thinks about our relationship with nature, and how that can be sustained in globalization in the long run. And if we don't, of course, do that, the argument is that while globalization brings many benefits in terms of increasing jobs and welfare and lifestyles of people around the planet, that ultimately we will run up against a brick wall, and there will be a big distinction then at that point in time between the haves and the have-nots, because the have-nots will be the ones that are suffering from the environmental destruction because they don't have the money to protect themselves from rising sea levels, from increasing temperatures, etc., etc. So let's talk a little bit more about this question of the haves and the have-nots, by the way. The next slide is very, very telling. And here we raise the question of what happens if everyone lives a Western lifestyle. It's a kind of a distorted map of the planet Earth. And right now, what this image is showing us is, in comparison to the regular map of the planet Earth, what we're looking at here is a slide that shows us whether human beings in different parts of the world have a equitable use of environmental resources. Now we of course, as human beings, would like everyone to live a lifestyle the way that we live a lifestyle. We would like them to share our comfort and our access to health and resources, and from a social justice point of view, if we put human beings at the center of our discourse, then of course we would like for this map of the planet that we're looking at here to look like the regular map of the planet, or something more like it, because at least that would suggest that we have an equitable distribution of resources. But if we think about the population concentrations, we notice that many of the small countries that are looking rather huge on this map cannot possibly be living in a social justice scenario or relationship with other countries on the planet. Looking at those other countries, we see, for example, India, one of the most popular countries on the planet, populous countries on the planet. We look at China, one of the most populous countries on the planet, and yet they are relatively small, even though they look quite big on this map. That would be fair enough, because they have literally together, I think, 1/5 of the entire planet's population. But they do not occupy 1/5 of the planet's mass in this map. Instead, when we look at the United Kingdom, or we look at the United States, or we look at the European countries, we see much smaller countries in terms of population being represented as absolutely huge relative to their size. So, and then we look at countries like Africa, countries in Africa who hardly show up on this map at all, and South America, they hardly show up on the map at all, because their resource consumption on a per capita basis is so small. So the question is, if this map was actually fair, right, these countries would look much more like their normal size, and they would, at least China and India would be a lot bigger, but the rest of the countries would look much more realistic, I think. So if it's often said, but if we had a fair situation, however, and this raises a huge problem for us, if there was fair planetary resource consumption, then we would probably need 3 more planets worth of resources in order to achieve that goal. So this really does beg a question then from a social justice point of view. If social justice cannot be achieved on the standard of a Western lifestyle, then on what basis can social justice be achieved in a way that is sustainable vis-a-vis the limited nature of the planet's resources? Wealthy countries obviously do use a lot of resources to develop, but the irony is that these wealthy countries are now in this age of global warming and environmental tension, asking these poorer countries to hold off on becoming large-scale consumers. And the question is whether, having had the head start that the Western countries received, and the advantage that they received in terms of extracting resources in the early stage of their development through imperialism, say in Africa and Southeast Asia and South America, isn't it rich? Isn't it rich for the European and the Western countries to be turning around now and saying, look, the environment's under threat and you guys can't develop? I think a lot of people in the poorer part of the world would be like, well, okay, well, what can you do for us in that instance? Because based on our labor and our resources, you guys got a head start, so surely you owe us a bit of a favor now if you're going to start preaching about the environment, having already extracted an advantage from us at a time when the environment wasn't such a big deal. And I don't know, I guess that's up to you guys to think about. What do you feel about that accusation or that suggestion? Clearly, climate change is impacting on the politics of the planet. Now, this is not mentioned in Simon Dolby's chapter, but I wanted to discuss it with you anyway because I think it's such a profoundly interesting book. It's Christian Parenti's book, Tropic of Chaos. It just came out last year, back in maybe the end of 2011 or the start of 2012. It came out, and it starts with this story about the murder of a local citizen in Africa, in a part of Africa, East Africa, called Karu Laruman. And East Africa, he argues, is not a gun manufacturing part of the world, generally speaking, but it is awash with guns. And the question is why? Because in the aftermath of the Cold War, with the Western and Eastern Bloc countries having duked it out by proxy, a war in Africa, there of course is just a staggering amount of weaponry still in use and left over from those days. It's often said that an AK-47 in sub-Saharan Africa is cheaper than a daily meal. So how is that possible, and where did that context come from? Parenti focuses on powerful businessmen and politicians in Uganda and the underlying social relations that cause them to see profit in supplying funds for such activities. Of course, we have all kinds of resources available to unscrupulous businessmen in these parts of the world, and they're willing to use child soldiers. They're willing to use the availability of cheap weapons to fuel their resource extraction methods. But who created these borders? Who created these artificial countries that cannot sustain Western-style governance practices that are capable of securing people's lives, giving them basic safety, and providing basic governance? Why are there borders between these countries anyway? Whose interests did it serve to establish these borders? What we have to understand is that these borders are highly artificial and come from an imperial legacy where the Western countries literally divided up Africa in a fairly arbitrary way, dividing cultures, dividing peoples that naturally live together and forcing them to live amongst each other, as, for example, so terribly witnessed in Rwanda a decade ago now. So where does the question of climate change come in here? Well, climate change is not Africa's fault, but certainly the borders there that create the ethnic tension that we saw in places like Rwanda, that are a legacy of Western imperial powers and their interactions with these areas in the past, certainly do run into climate change, and their politics are now increasingly bound up with the question of climate change, as climate change increases what we call a resource scarcity. And what we're talking about there, of course, is the ability of people to grow food and to clothe themselves, to feed themselves, to find shelter. Darfur, of course, is a name that many of you may know, and we know that climate change already is driving people down from the northern part of Sudan into the Darfur area. And one of the reasons why we had such conflict in Darfur was the arrival of climate change migrants, you might say, looking for new arable lands for which to graze, and finding that people already existed in those lands. So they started to push those people out and try to claim that land for themselves. So we have just to deal with the fact that climate change is bringing changes in terms of regional rainfall, creating droughts for a lot of people in these areas, drying out the farmland of various regions, and making the lives of people very precarious, while simultaneously shrinking the availability and geographical extent of water holes, which of course will result in the death of cattle, and putting groups that were previously not in contact with each other into contact, and actually creating violent tensions between them. So Parenti's book is about how climate change is affecting regional politics. And you may say, well, why does that matter to us? Well, it matters to us because if nothing else, it affects our national security. As Parenti puts it, it's not out of nowhere that Islamic fundamentalism and militant extremism is born. Oftentimes it's born in conditions of dire poverty and ignorance that comes with dire poverty. And so whether it's the impact of refugees flooding the borders of Western countries, looking for food, looking for shelter, looking for jobs, or whether it's the impact of terrorism on our cities and security down the road, global warming matters for us, not just because of impact in the environment in some abstract sense, but also impact on our very, very human politics. So let's talk a little bit about global warming then. If it's already creating, as Parenti argues, change in our political situation, if it's already clear that we have this debate between the advantages of globalization and the fact that we don't, as things currently stand, pay the cost of the externalities that we're putting on the environment, it's very, very clear, by the way, that these costs are mounting, that these costs are serious, and that in order to achieve a proper social justice situation where we're living in a sustainable relationship with the planet, these costs would have to be factored into things like our sandwich from Pittsburgh that we were talking about earlier on. The sheer cost of it would put us back in a situation where we're producing those sandwiches locally, I would argue, and a lot of other people I think would agree. But maybe this is all unconvincing as of yet. So let's look at the actual data. Let's look at the statistics here. And on this slide, I don't know if you can see it on your YouTube very well. So if you can't, please check out the PDF of this slide on the Blackboard page. But what we're looking at here is an argument made to us in the data. This is actually extracted from Al Gore's movie Inconvenient Truth. But Bill McKibben is making a very similar argument, and we'll be talking about Bill McKibben in a little while. Mathematically, McKibben argues that we are not only past the point of no return in terms of global warming, i.e. global warming is happening now, and you guys have your book that you're reading, the book review that you're reading for this semester is by Bill McKibben. It's called Earth, Eaarth, and he's renaming Earth in order to reflect the fact that global warming is here, and we no longer live on the same planet that his generation was born into. The climate has clearly changed. And so the question is, what point is the point of no return that he identifies whereby we start living on planet Earth, if indeed that is a useful term for us? And he's arguing that it's 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. If you look at the long sweep of human history, and we see a timeline presented to us on the bottom of this graph, we have 50,000 year increments that we're tracing back. So we're going back almost 500,000 years in the long sweep of human history that we can record by sampling from ice core drilling in the Arctic Circle. We can measure or ascertain the amount of carbon dioxide that was in the planet. And looking at, the sampling techniques that we have, we can tell through the various stages of history how much carbon dioxide was in the planet and how warm it was relative to the amount of carbon dioxide. And we can see that, broadly speaking, there is a track. Now, some people argue that there's a lag here. Sometimes it catches up, sometimes it slows down. It's not entirely clear whether there's a cause or effect relationship, but there is clearly a relationship. And what Bill McKibben is suggesting to us is that regardless of how you see that relationship, we are way, way, way above in terms of parts per million of carbon dioxide right now. Even the highest previously recorded ice core sample level of carbon dioxide that tracked global warming in previous iterations. So what does that mean? It means for him very, very clearly that we can expect on aggregate a very, very phenomenal amount of warming to take place. And you can see the amount of degrees that would imply in terms of our planetary warming. On the left-hand side, temperature variation, it says, from 1961 to 1990 average. So we have not yet seen temperature increases of 6, 7, 8 degree levels, but we clearly can see evidence that we have raised the temperatures, planet's temperature, by about 1.5 degrees now, or maybe even a little bit more than that. Now the question is, actually I'm going to correct myself. We have raised the planet's temperature by, I think, 0.8 degrees, but we're on track. Even if we stopped emitting emissions today, we would be on track for a doubling of that. Now, interesting, the Kyoto agreement, you may remember the Kyoto negotiations from a few years back, where the governments of the Earth got together and established a limit that they were willing to tolerate of global warming. That limit was 2 degrees. And the question is, how much more wiggle room do we have relative to that 2 degree mark? Well, Bill McKibben argues in his recent publications that basically what global warming comes from is when we're turning rocks into air, i.e. we're literally putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And he suggests that prior to the Industrial Revolution, the Earth was at about 270 parts of CO2 per million in the atmosphere. Now we are approaching 400. And if we burn all the fossil fuels that we have at our disposal at the moment, we will actually shoot way past 500 parts per million. The current warming that we've seen at 350 parts per million then would bring us eventually significantly over the 2 degree mark. And what I mean by that is the current parts per million, the trend of our continued rate of increase will shoot way past 350 in the next 10 to 20 years. So what Bill McKibben is suggesting is that indeed we have about 350 as our goal if we want to stay at the 2 degree level. But even if we stopped emitting today, the planet will continue to warm by another 0.8 degree. So that brings us in at just under 2 degrees global warming. But because of inertia, which is the difficulty of turning around the global economy such that it's configured for a lower use of carbon, because of inertia, we won't be stopping today, so we will go past the 2 degree mark. And the question is, by how much? Bill McKibben argues that the worst case scenario is that we go ahead and continue to burn carbon-based fuels. And if we do that, we will go possibly up to 500 parts per million. And you can do the math. That would possibly, he's suggesting, bring us up to an 8 degree warming. If we go up to an 8 degree warming, we will, literally have changed the nature of the planet without any chance of being able to turn it around. So here you see some of Bill McKibben's numbers. As he notes, in Kyoto and also in Copenhagen, we had sorry, my notes are not cooperating here. I don't know why that's so. There we go. The Copenhagen goal, the Kyoto goal were 2 degrees Celsius, but today we're at 0.8 degrees. We're 3/4 of our on the way to achieving this 2 degree goal, though, because of the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that exists right now. That's where, again, I said we're approaching 400. But even if we stop today, the inertia of the system would keep going, and we would clearly reach very, very close to 2 degrees. The remaining scope for consumption of carbon is 565 gigatons of carbon. Currently, we have enough fuel to create 2,795 gigatons of carbon. And so that's an important sense then of where we can go with this vis-a-vis the numbers we were just looking at in the previous slide. Spring 2012, Bill McKibben argues, was the warmest ever recorded in the United States of America. In fact, it crushed the old record by so much that it represented the largest temperature departure from average of any season in record. That is to say, in recorded history in the United States, spring 2012 was significantly past any other previous record in temperature for a spring in the contiguous United States. That same week, by the way, he argues, the Saudi authorities reported that it had rained in Mecca despite a temperature of 109 degrees, and that constitutes the hottest downpour in the planet's history, the hottest rainfall that's ever occurred, 109 degrees in Saudi Arabia last year. Now, the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009 suggested that the scientific view, and I'm quoting here, the scientific view that the increase in global temperature should be below 2 degrees Celsius is established, right? So scientists are basically saying 2 degrees is about as warm as we can allow the planet to get. They agree that deep cuts in global emissions are required so as to hold the increase in global temperature to below 2 degrees Celsius. But as Bill McKibben is arguing in relation to this, so far we've raised the average temperature of the planet just under 8 degrees Celsius. So far, now then, we are under halfway towards our goal, but even if we stopped increasing CO2 now, the temperature would still likely rise another 0.8 degree. So really, in terms of wiggle room, we only have 0.4 degrees wiggle room left. And that translates, as we see on the slide here, into 565 gigatons. So the question is, though, given that we have, almost 6 times that amount of fuel identified in the planet that we can burn, what are we going to do? Are we seeing the change? Are we seeing the commitment to change in the planet's government? Arguably, we're not. And the image on the screen here just shows you what the stakes are. The impact of sea level rise in Florida. The dark blue areas are less than 5 meters, 16 feet above sea level. All we need then is a very modest increase in the planet's amount of water in the oceans, and we would see significant land loss in Florida. So that is a really serious question for us. What are we willing to tolerate? Now, there's been a sharp uptake in disaster culture in recent years, and I think people are kind of obsessed about the idea of disaster. We see zombie movies, we see Day After Tomorrow, we see 2012, the Mayan prophecy, and this kind of thing. And what's worrying, I suppose, philosophically speaking, about some of these movies is that they're kind of speaking to us about a sort of the fact that we can't really do anything about any of these changes. And that's an interesting question for us, like that this is all beyond our control. So culturally, at least, there's this response, this tendency to respond to global warming and potential disasters is kind of throwing your hands up in the air and say, well, can't do anything about it, may as well bury our heads in the sand and just try to be happy. But then there's also this other response, and actually this slide I didn't have a chance to complete. I should have an image of Naomi Klein here, but hopefully I'll touch that up in a little while. But today, anyway, just a sort of a note on this, there's another response, which is to sort of not just accept global warming, but to sort of say, it's all just made up. This is sort of a left-wing conspiracy, and there's nothing wrong with the planet at all. Global warming hasn't been proved, and there's no need to worry. Well, that's an interesting response because it suggests something of an emerging cynicism that didn't used to be there about the status of science in our minds. And we've last week and the week before done a lot of talking about, trash talking about science when it comes to human affairs. And when it comes to thinking about a science of politics, we've argued that it's hard for us to leave our baggage and our prejudices at the door of the classroom when we come into the classroom to talk about science, and we've talked about that. But there's a big difference, I think, between talking about human affairs, scientific and social affairs from a scientific point of view, and admitting that we traffic with us into the classroom our biases and prejudices that might have been there from a long, long time ago, with a generalized skepticism about the scientific project as a whole. And how can I back that up? Well, one way I would back that up is to say that, there's a huge difference between studying something that you're a part of, i.e. the human race, and thinking about prejudice as it exists in relationship to our other human beings. So, i.e. the question of the phrenologists, for example, and their intrinsic racism, or Aristotle and his intrinsic sexism, and we've talked about all those things. And I think there's a difference between that kind of a move and talking about the natural world. And I know that that's not exactly a perfect argument, because surely prejudice and bias does creep into our analyses of the natural world too. All kinds of reasons why for that, by the way. The people's self-interests, for example. We know that in the big pharma, a lot of people, big pharmaceutical industry, for example, a lot of people are worried that the science that's coming out of pharmaceutical industry sponsored. I'm just going to put this on pause for a second, folks.